KASSAI, the terror of the Golden Sands, walks the merciless path of a battle-hardened warrior, each step leaving the sand stained with the blood of her enemies. And if you want to take up her swords yourself, then you've come to the right place, because today we're going to talk about an aggressive version of this KASSAI deck and how it helped me earn a top 4 spot at last weekend's ProQuest. So let's talk about the deck. I have been on KASSAI of the Golden Sand basically since the Calling Queenstown in January, and I haven't really pivoted off of her. She's been the one hero on my mind this entire time. I've played literally every version of the deck that I could get my hands on. I have been addicted to KASSAI, and I feel as though she's going to be the hero that I continue to play unless she absolutely falls off the map in some way, shape, or form. Guys, she's literally a pirate. By the way, let's just talk about the fact that she's literally a pirate. She attacks with swords, creates gold. She like wins gold off of her opponents, and she straight up has a crew. Like, she's a pirate. They needed one flavor swap and they'd give us literally the perfect pirate. It's amazing. You pay gold and like copper and other coins to do more broken stuff. Okay, so like I love KASSAI, and I want to show you where I've taken this deck. And I've settled on this one and I have not pivoted off of it. In fact, if you're curious, you can't see the drop downs, unfortunately, but if you look here and the latest versions, I can go all the way back to 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, I mean, this goes on. I've made change after change. This is the version of the list that I ran in ProQuest last weekend. This is the exact version that I printed out and ran in my ProQuest. And this is the current version that we're going to take a look at today. And if you are a patron, I will give you this exact deck list with the breakdowns and the matchup guide. Every single thing. I will literally just share this exact thing with you, and you can just take it to town and try it out for yourself. And if you need some cards to build this deck, or really any other deck, then you should check out this video and this channel's sponsor, MinMax Games. MinMax Games are fantastic people that are committed to providing for the flesh and blood community. They want to set you up to succeed, and I've heard tell that if you buy from MinMax Games, you will get multiple gold stacked into your order. I don't actually know if that's true, but ask for it in the little tag when you order. Say, hey, DM Armada said you would give me multiple gold tokens. So maybe they'll get you the hookup there. Check it out. MinMax Games, link in the description. This is not the standard mid-range control version of KASSAI. KASSAI is fantastic in that she is incredibly flexible and can be played in a variety of ways. The predominant way that KASSAI is being played right now is mid-range control, a value-based game. It's essentially kind of like Hatchets, but on a different axis with more fun on hits and more fun decision-making. That's the general version of KASSAI. The cool thing about KASSAI, though, is that you can build her with slightly different compositions and play her at a more aggressive slant while still tapping into some of that value game and that sort of mid-range game. That's what's incredible about this hero. And so we've taken her and we've put her in a far more aggressive stance with the mindset that our goal is to get our opponent to low life totals and then threaten them with attack reactions. Okay, that's why we call this Attack React KASSAI. And I will say there's 2 main points to this deck. One, we play more attack reactions than just about any deck I've ever seen on KASSAI, any KASSAI version I've ever seen. And 2, this is truly a cash-in deck. The theory behind this deck is that we want to use our gold not to create persistent threats on the board, which can fairly easily be removed unless you're playing against like Guardian. Every other hero we want to play cash in into. If they can deal with a Centauri Sellsword token fairly easily, then we are not on that game plan. And instead, we are playing what is essentially a modified race plan against them, because we can put out surprising amounts of damage thanks to cash-in. Why? Well, look at what cash-in is. It's essentially a KASSAI specialization. It's a yellow in a deck that cares about reds and yellows to create gold. You can pay for it by destroying gold in a hero that creates gold. It draws you 2 cards. First of all, drawing cards in Flesh and Blood is broken. Second of all, drawing cards makes your swords free. So everything tells us that this card is insanely above rate in this deck. And that's a very good thing because we've built our deck towards that outcome. We start with a gold on the board thanks to Crown of Dominion, which means that we can go turn 1 cash in and immediately grab tempo if we draw it. If we don't draw cash in for several turns, that is totally fine as well, because we can play a mid-range to mid-range aggressive game plan in our matchups. We can take these turn cycles with maximum value while also pressuring our opponent's life total. We can lean more towards taking some damage if we are presenting more damage. Really quickly, let's go over the equipment. We've got your standard Centauri Saber. Hot Streak is a huge get. If you're not playing Hot Streak, I would love to know the argument as to why. I will say this, 2 Centauri Sabers is fantastic. That's where this deck started. And then I realized that Hot Streak just provides you a little bit more value without giving up literally anything. In the decks, in the matchups with the decks that you are playing against who have attack action cards, this can sometimes just save your turn, because if they don't block it, they're taking damage and you're probably creating a gold. And if they do block it, then they're giving you an attack action card, and this is basically go again, which is fantastic. In the matchups where your opponent's never going to block with an attack action card, it's basically the same thing as Centauri Saber, because Centauri Saber would also never get the buff by not being blocked by an attack action card. So these two are basically the same, except this has a slight upside in that you can get attack action go again. Braveforge Bracers, I thought about pivoting over to Ironsong Versus, but they've been so solid and so consistent that I've stuck with them, and I've never, wavered off of Braveforge Bracers. Feels great. Though you could, if you want to run Ironsong Versus, feel free. Help yourself. This is a Grains of Bloodspill deck. Again, these are the only pieces of equipment that we have outside of the 2 sideboard cards. Grains of Bloodspill is a must use. I think this card can break open KASSAI. The fact that you can have 1 Vigor and you can turn 1 Vigor in 1 red card in hand into popping a gold, and your swords are free. There's nuts things that you can do with a singular Vigor, and sometimes a single Vigor just saves your turn in aggressive sort of I have to block at this exact moment type of matchups. And so Grains is absolutely huge. And yes, it is possible to pitch into it just fine in this deck. Valiant Dynamo, because this thing is like Crown of Seeds, except it's more fun and more fair. It is just pure value, and we're almost always swinging twice on a turn, and so we can very easily commit to a consistent block on this. And then finally, we are playing Crown of Dominion because, like I said, you start with a gold, and you can immediately go into cash-in turns from that point. I used to, for a brief moment, I had the Balance of Justice in as a sideboard option, and I found that in the matchups where I would probably bring it in, it's kind of a toss-up anyway. I'm just as fine running Crown of Dominion, and it hasn't been too much of an issue, but there is enough room if you want to cut it to go for Balance of Justice. Now, let's talk about the deck, because like I said, this is called Attack React KASSAI, and it's called that because we run 3 Blade Flurries, we run 3 In the Swings, we run 1 Puncture, we run 2 Stroke of Foresight, and we run 3 Ironsong Response in the sideboard for the matchups that you expect your opponent to be blocking in. So that's 12 attack reactions, which is a good bit more than what most people run. Most people are running either 8 or 9, some combination of Blade Flurry. Some people are down to 2 In the Swings, and some people are at 2 to 3 Stroke of Foresights. Almost no one runs Puncture, and I did add Puncture back into the deck list recently, and I think people not running this card is probably wrong. I think this card's just really good right now into all the armor that Brutes and Guardians have. Puncture just feels quite nice. And so, yeah, this is the attack reaction package. If I could put more attack reactions in, I would. In fact, I'm looking to probably include 1 random yellow attack reaction. And I'm not even talking about the blue attack reactions, which come up in longer, grindier games like Fatal Engagement and Overpower as well. Oops, as I click the wrong button. Nevertheless, the other thing that this deck does, besides play a solid attack reaction package, is play 0 for 4s in Slice and Dice. Again, this is an aggressive version of the list. Not all lists out there run Slice and Dice, but I think it is just that good, particularly if you're playing Cash-In. Drawing a Slice and Dice red off of Cash-In is nuts. In fact, drawing anything in this deck off of Cash-In outside of a few of these blues is nuts. Drawing into any of your attack reactions and just punishing your opponent for not blocking correctly is fantastic. Drawing into Spoils of War to give go again and on hits is fantastic. drawing into Nourishing Emptiness and playing that out on the end of your turn is really fantastic. And so this deck is designed to draw into good things and play them down. And those good things include Slice and Dice. I think it's a very powerful card. And if you're playing the aggressive version of this list, or of this hero, I should say, that this list presents to you, then Slice and Dice is a must. If you're playing a more min-range control, yeah, this card is a good cut. You cut this card because you're trying to play more defensive options. We're not doing that. We are playing aggressively. Now, let's break down the ratios of this deck as it stands. We run 56 cards in the main board. If you want to cut a few of these cards and play around with it yourself, feel free. We have 24 reds currently, and let's go ahead and separate these by name and pitch so you can see. We have 24 reds, and you're going to be adding in several more reds when you fill this to 60, and oftentimes I go up to 62 with this list. These reds are pretty solid across the board. We have 17 yellows, and I've gone away from 17, but I oftentimes just return back to it. It feels the best. I ran the hypergeometric calculations, and it fits the best way that I prefer. 17 yellows, and then we have 15 blues. I was up from 14 now to 15 by including, I think I included blue overpower, one singular copy of it, and I'm like okay with it now. But I might go back down to that and up the yellow count if I can. Go to 14 as well, 14 blues and 18 yellows. Nevertheless, that is the main board as far as ratios are concerned, so very red heavy, but we have a lot more yellows than a lot of people are running. A lot of people are running something like 17, 18 blues and only like 12 to 13 yellows. And I personally want to activate KASSAI more. I want to create on-hit possibilities for my opponent to have to think about and choose to either block or not block. If I'm doing that, I'm asking questions, kind of like what Dorinthia does, and I want to do that of my opponent. We want to ask questions that our opponent messes up on, because they can't possibly, well, they can. They can surmise what we might have as far as attack reactions are concerned, but if you're playing with closed deck lists, these numbers, 2 Stroke of Foresight and a Puncture, and then some number of Iron Song responses you can side in. If you want to cut an in the swing and include another red attack reaction, feel free. Those types of numbers just make things very difficult to kind of calculate. Yes, you can calculate +3, but when does it happen? Does it happen on the first swing, the second swing? Are you pocketing the attack reaction into the arsenal to save for a moment where you care about an on-hit? Those are the questions that you have to ask. And when your opponent is at that sub 10 life, everything becomes lethal. That's very good for you. It's very, very good for you. As a warrior, this is what we thrive on, is putting our opponent to 10 life or less and then making everything just an agonizing decision point, because you have to decide which attack reaction I have in my hand, if any, and then how you plan to block and what you plan to deal with. And that can really crumble a player. The best players will figure it out, and that's on them to do so. But you are forcing them into mistake-making scenarios. Continuing on the ratios side of things, let's go ahead and count the number of go-agains in the deck. I believe it's 24. We've got 3, 6, 9. We have 12. I'm not going to count blood on our hands, even though oftentimes we do use it for that. 15, 18, 21, 24 sources of go again. If you want to go into the sideboard, we can say 27 with the Take It on the Chins. That is 24, and that is about average for most KASSAI decks that I've seen. Some trend towards that 27 mark, and that is totally fine as well. Technically, if you want to count blood on our hands, that can also be considered 27 in the main board, if you will. That is a fine number. You're going to sometimes run into the hand where you don't draw a go again source, but that is so much more rare than you think. I mean, if you're worried about it, we can run the stats. If we go 62 with 28 copies, 27 copies in the deck, and we want one go again source, like exactly 1 is 32% of the time, but 1 or greater is 91% of the time. Like you're okay. So don't worry if you're worried about 27 or 24 specifically. Those numbers are totally fine. The amount of yellows that we have, like I mentioned earlier, is important, but let's talk about which ones I included. Blood on our hands is good, but it's not the end-all be-all of the deck like many assume. We only create copper off of Spoils turns and off of Outland Skirmish. That is okay if you only have 4 copper in the end game scenario. That's no big deal at all. The way to play this out is you stack up your spoils turns. Don't just play spoils into like naked sword with go again into naked sword. That is not going to create enough space for you to gain copper. Play a arsenal of spoils, I should say, and play a spoils on a turn where you have a bigger hand, or you're sitting on an attack reaction that you've drawn into, or you play a cash in. Those are the turns where you make your copper, and then they set you up for a very easy end game by drawing singular card Blood on Our Hands and having a gold or a copper with some resources floating. So like Blood on Our Hands is good. It's not the end all be all, and you have to actually play into it to create that much copper. If you don't like that, cut yellow slice and dice and add a yellow outland skirmish. There you go. There's your kind of ticket in. I play 2 Raisin armies. I might go to 3, but I kind of feel 2 feels good. Oftentimes, if I get this early, turn 1, I will play Raisin army. I will name 0 gold to destroy, and I will put a yellow in my graveyard. Like, boom, easy. It's also a great blocking card. In the matchups that you care about it, you definitely want to have it, and you want to care about it. Sometimes you pitch stack it. Sometimes you just play it, and you get 1 or 2 Centauri sellswords. I have had 3 Centauri sellswords. You don't oftentimes need 3 with this number of blues, but if you're playing a grindy end game, 3 feels pretty solid. Ironsong Determination is a card that, again, feels very good into a lot of matchups that are attempting to just kind of grind you out and play this like back and forth, I'm taking all your cards and sort of slowly fatiguing you game. Ironsong Determination can just win you the game. You pitch these early, you find them second cycle, you can set them up alongside of a couple of other big attacks. This card has so much utility. It costs you nothing in a deck that runs a lot of reds. It is a yellow, it is a 3 block, and it gives Dominate, which makes your on hits go through, unless they play defense reactions in a very inefficient manner. Like, I don't know why this card isn't being played more, and I'm honestly considering going to 3 of it if it were more value than a 0 for 3. That's the only reason that it's sitting at 2. And the rest of this is pretty straightforward. As far as blues are concerned, it's pretty straightforward. I like the one of Fatal Engagement. I've recently come on to that because you can use it on Command and Conquer in late game scenarios. You can use it on Nourishing Emptiness in late game scenarios as well. Overpower, I'm iffy on. This used to be Heart of Fiendal, and I might go back to Heart of Fiendal, but it is nice to have another attack reaction at the end. And Warmonger's Diplomacy is for Azalea, but I don't know, man. I don't know. I might cut this card. Because we might need more Prism Tech, let's be honest. Prism Tech is kind of the name of the game. Outside of that, that's basically the list. Let's talk about a couple of things in the sideboard. First of all, there's only 2 equipment in the sideboard. It's Null Rune, and therefore Kano, because AB2 is all you need. I pivoted off of AB3 back in February. Literally, I was like, how am I going to beat Kano? Probably not with AB3, because I'm only pitching like 14 blues. So I went to AB2, and then I started running 1 copy of Oasis. I recently changed it to 2 copies of Oasis because I figured I could run this in Azalea matchups. And then I went from 2 Take It on the Chins after ProQuest to 3 because the card's just really good. I've pivoted back and forth between 2 and 3, and it feels fantastic either way. So I might go back to 2. I might stay at 3. I mean, this card almost always comes into most matchups, so it's really up to you. Command and Conquer is one of those cards that comes in basically every matchup as well. Sometimes it doesn't if like my opponent isn't planning to do much arsenaling. Sometimes it doesn't if like I don't want a ton of attack action cards in my deck. But even in those matchups, like I think it's kind of fine. Heck, you bring it in versus Victor to try and mess up their like trounces, and you try and mess up their like their test of strengths and stuff like that. So like it fits really well. Ironsong Response, you only bring in if your opponent is going to do any blocking whatsoever, or if you feel like it's going to be a grindy game that they'll block towards the end. Like maybe you can consider this in Azalea just because it allows you to like get them to an end game state and then they just die to everything. I have 1 Fate Foreseen in here because I wanted more defensive choices into Azalea, something like a Sink Belows, of which we have in here as well, and I wanted 1 more. I also considered this for Prism. I used to, in fact, in the ProQuest version of the list, I included, let me show you, I included 2 Humbles, And I never ran them, but I feel like they would be quite good both into, well, fairly good into Azalea and pretty good into Prism as well as poppers. I don't have Down and Dirties in the list, and I could possibly go convinced to include Down and Dirties instead, but I'm feeling pretty happy with the amount of things that I have right now. Time Snap Potion is technically just in for Prism, but the more I think about it, the more I'm like, we probably want to be able to, in grindier matchups, have the capacity to bring this in and to do the really cool Nourishing Emptiness loop. So if you don't know this, Nourishing Emptiness is one of those cards where it says, while there's no attack action cards in your graveyard, it gets Dominate, and if it hits, you gain Intellect. But the Dominate part is the interesting part, because KASSAI banishes cards out of her graveyard, which means that if you have a bunch of like CNCs in your graveyard, you can get rid of them, so Nourishing is active again. So why is that important? Well, technically into grindier matchups that want to block you out, you can play down a Time Snap Potion on the end of your turn and then pitch stack to where you have 2 Nourishings in hand. At which point you can pop the Time Snap Potion to get 2 action points. And with 2 blues and a Nourishing Emptiness, like in Arsenal or in hand or whatever, like 2 blues and 2 Nourishings, you can literally go Nourishing without breaking the chain, second Nourishing. 2 sources of 6 Dominate that can vault over the top of, like an opponent's defenses. That is a real line that I have played out in some games, which is kind of cool. So I bring this in sometimes into grindier matchups. The matchups I think that are really just trying to fatigue me, I can pop this in there as well. It's also good for Prism for trying to break out of the loop, but here's the problem with Prism. Yeah, she's just gonna go like Iris now, which really sucks. Iris is terrible. No one likes Iris Prism. Just kidding. There's lots of people that like Iris Prism. But if that's the case, then we need some different tech, and I'm going to talk about some options here in a moment. I also bring this in against Kano because it's another source of arcane barrier, essentially, and it's another blue that I can pitch into and float 1 to use Oasis on. Sink Belows I bring into matchups like Katsu where I want to stop on hits. But there's not a ton of those, so this is starting, in my opinion, to fall out of favor. The thing about this deck, again, she's incredibly good at defending. All of her cards block 3. I mean, if we look at the stats of this deck, like in the main board right now of 56 cards, none of them are no blocks, and then like all of them essentially block 3. 53 of those cards of 56 block 3, and then there are 3 cash-ins that block 2. So this deck defends quite well in comparison to a lot of decks, because everything here can be thrown in front of something, and then you can figure out the best turn after that. So Sink Belows and Fate for Scenes, like I look at that and I go, okay, if we're playing aggressively, we want to end the game before the second cycle. Are these tools actually necessary? Like Take It on the Chin is like 2 prevention plus an agility token. So that to me like checks the box of what we need. Whereas Sink Below and Fate for Scene are a little bit less impressive. At least they have been lately, though they have come in clutch into a couple of matchups like Azuri at times. And then finally, if we're talking about matchups, I feel like KASSAI is really good into Guardians, has been very good into Brutes, has been pretty decent into just about everything else now that Dromai is gone. I don't know where this deck will stand with Iris Prism running around. Funnily enough, this deck actually can go okay with Herald Prism, the ones that are trying to play more aggressively because they think you don't have as many poppers. The reason is they can send their Heralds and they can push their damage, and we can give them their on hits and they can create their angels. But when we send a sword and then we attack react after they've clean blocked it, they lose their angels. Yes, they don't take the damage perhaps, but they can't keep angels on the boards with attack reactions. And we can oftentimes just like poke and deal with a lot of stuff, which is kind of nice. Now, the problem with this, of course, is when they play a very heavy aura build. And so for that, one card that I have had on my mind so much lately is this one. Hack to Reality seems like a card that might be worth throwing into the sideboard if we see a lot of Aura Prism, because this gives your next attack. This includes attack action cards as well, +2. And the next time you hit a hero this turn, destroy a non-token aura they own with cost less than or equal to the damage dealt this way, which means that if we hit it all, we destroy any of the Prism's 0 cost auras, which feels quite good. And if we deal a lot of damage, we can pop things like Genesis. How would you go about doing that? Attack reactions. Remember, we're playing a deck full and replete with attack reactions, meaning that Hacked Reality, even on a no go again turn, can threaten to take away one of those big auras on the board. I'm not 100% sold, but it's definitely on my mind of things to try. Okay, so let's go through a couple of sample hands. Now, I literally just started this up and drew up. So if this were the first turn of the game, depending on the matchup, I like the idea of pocketing Slice and Dice, and I like the idea of getting a yellow in the graveyard. Remember, this is a deck that really starts to get going once you get yellows and reds in the graveyard and immediately start activating KASSAI. So on a turn 0 scenario, I am more than happy playing this. I like going Hot Streak first, pitching Hit and Run. This is a deck that's also predicated on having 1 blue. And so if you have 1 blue in your hand, it is fantastic to be able to just do this exact pattern where you swing a sword first and play something like a Blade Runner for 1 to give go again. It's a very standard pattern, so I'm sure you know the one that I'm referring to here. You swing Centauri Saber, it gets the buff for Blade Runner, and in this case, it gets the Slice and Dice buff as well. This pushes 9 total damage, gives us an arsenal on turn 0. If you had a blue, you could, and you didn't want to pocket it, which is a very good idea, you could have made 2 Vigors on turn 1 as well if it hits. The other benefit here is that we've now filled a yellow and a red. So almost every turn I check to see if we have a yellow and a red or how many of each we have in the deck. Looking at our hand here, this feels like a pretty solid standard turn as well. We can't activate KASSAI, which means that this Slice and Dice feels like just pure damage. Depending on the matchup, you would more likely than not like to pair Slice and Dice up with an on-hit of Create a Gold. And so you could keep this in the pocket, but if you're racing, and there's actually a couple of matchups where you would race, and some of you wouldn't think, like I actually race in Viscerai, believe it or not. I don't play Arcane Barrier. Yeah, into every Viscerai, I race them down, and we just see who wins, and oftentimes I have a pretty decent record in that matchup. We want to pair this with most things like that either present an on-hit or just make it really hard for our opponent to deal with, but if we're racing, we just play it out there. Let's assume that we are in some sort of a mid-range scenario, hence why we brought in Iron Song responses, and we could block with said Iron Song response. I would feel fine with this. And at this point, I like the idea of getting Blade Flurry into Arsenal. So we would swap the Arsenal out and we would play the turn very similarly to what we played before, where we attack with Hot Streak. I like starting with Hot Streak because it gives the opponent the illusion of choice. If we don't have a go again source, then like they can pay us off by blocking with an attack action card. But even if they do block with an attack action card, I am more often than not just happy to get the buff that comes with Blade Runner and then swing the sword for 8. So again, this is a turn that presented a solid little 11 damage, and we could have presented a lot more than that, right? We could have presented 15 damage from those 5 cards. Feels pretty solid. And actually from 4 cards because we blocked with one of them. But in this way, we are able to just drop that in and continue playing this back and forth game plan. The moment I see something like a Blood on our hands and I don't have like any possible copper lines of play, I love blocking with it. Unless I need it for resources, this feels fantastic. And on a turn that looks like this, where we don't necessarily have a source of go again, if that ends up happening, more often than not, we end up drawing into one of these types of attacks. And if we do, well, it's just as easy for us to, block with one and play the other. So in this case, it's probably fine for us to do exactly this and not block with the Valiant Dynamo because we're not going to reset. I will oftentimes not block with Valiant Dynamo if I'm not going to get a reset, and I'm comfortable just playing this out there and threatening Arsenal, playing for 6. So I blocked 6 and I swung 6. That feels pretty solid to me. We continue to not draw cash-ins, and this happens sometimes, but again, we can play a very measured game plan. We can do something like, again, in this scenario, we can just do this. like, and not block with any of these. Remember, we still have equipment up. We can play very slowly and methodically, playing stuff like that, right? And continuing to try and dig through. But we can play that back and forth mid-range game plan just fine. Now, this is technically one of the first turns where we haven't had a go again source, and we haven't had like a big kind of swing power play. So a couple of things that you can do in scenarios like this is you can start by trying to draw a card. Like, this is a fine way to start. And of course we draw into a cash in here. But even if you didn't do that, let's just assume that we didn't, because you know, we can still play out a turn. You can do something as simple as like Iron Song Determination onto Hot Streak. And then you could activate KASSAI, getting rid of a couple of these attack actions that we've drawn into. And now all of a sudden this Hot Streak pitching here is 3 dominate with the Iron Song response in the arsenal. So if they block this, then they're trying to cover up the on hit. They can only block with 1 card. If they don't block this at all, then we get a gold. It's okay to not swing the sword twice if we get the gold here, or we get multiple cards out of their hands. It's also okay if they, you know, block 7 here, because this Iron Song response doesn't end up, you know, having any effect. That's totally fine because we've taken cards out of their hand. And if they give us go again, we have a resource floating to send Centauri Saber. So this is the reason I really like Hot Streak into just about every matchup, because even on turns where we don't have go again, this gives us the capacity for it, as well as it couples with a nice little on hit of creating a gold. And so like in this moment, let's say that they just don't respect it and they're like, cool, no blocks. I'm like, cool, I get a gold and I will create a vigor token. And finally, we draw into a cash in. And in doing so, you know, we can give whatever we want. We can keep a big hand. We could give these cards away as well. It doesn't really matter, because we can play a massive turn with a cash in, or we could play a more measured turn. But we'll start with the old cash in draw here. We do have a source of go again off of Precision Press. And we can activate KASSAI. This is totally fine. We can stack up things like this and then pitch into that. And the cool thing about our scenario now is that we can play any of these attacks. We can play out either of these attacks and feel just really good about it. They are free because we drew cards. So Hot Streak is now for 5 go again, thanks to the Precision Press. Piercing. If our opponent chooses to block, then we can Stroke of Foresight, or we can Iron Song Response. Both of those are fine. If they don't, so be it. We will pitch blue to create a vigor. From this point, we can pitch into Brave Forge after a hit, which feels great. We can also play Iron Song Determination. I like playing this after the first sword swing because you can oftentimes bait out defense reactions on your first attack to try and prevent the on hit create a gold, if that is a thing that you know, is capable. So you can do those types of plays just fine, and then you can swing this. And this is technically not for 4, it's actually for 10, right? Because if we play both of these, and assuming that our opponent blocks, this swings for 10. And this is a very solid turn, a quite solid turn, right? This is, by the way, 10 dominate. You just, on the face of it, it was 4 dominate. Which feels quite good. It feels really good. And our Valiant Dynamos reset and so on and so forth. So the deck plays really smoothly, and it looks like pretty standard damage, but the more you dig into the way the deck functions and the way the deck plays, the more you can find like these little value moments where blocking in the correct way and then creating the vigors at the right time gives you way more value than you ever would have thought. Like, for example, I don't know, let's just play out this turn as well. Let's give a Valiant Dynamo block. Our vigor pops. We could actually pitch into a gold here. I don't know, something like this maybe. And all of a sudden we've got ourselves a blue Blade Runner. We can Spoils of War. We can crack here. Get rid of a couple of things. So now our on hits are create 2 copper, create a gold. We can send Hot Streak with go again. It already has go again, which is nice because of spoils, which means that we don't even have to pitch into that. We can send Centauri Saber with an on hit. We could even give it go again if we wanted to. And then we could follow that up with Nourishing Emptiness Dominated, right? So we have the capacity to play a turn out that looks like 4 with 2 on hits, 2 with 2 on hits, Technically, yeah, 2 on hits. Yep. And then Nourishing for 6 Dominate. So what does our opponent want to do in that scenario? Do they want to stop the gold? We already have several. Do they want to stop the copper? That's probably a good idea. Do they want to take a Dominated at the end and then give me 5 cards? Like, the deck works. The deck just works, and it helped me get to a top 4 finish in a ProQuest, and I've been doing quite well with it outside of that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something about KASSAI. I hope you pick this up and run with it. And if you want to try this exact list, I will have a link for a simplified version in the description, a more detailed version of this that you were looking at earlier in Patreon. So support on Patreon, and you can check that out. And then, you know, go and run it out there and try to play this slightly reskinned pirate, because let's be honest, that's what she is. She's a pirate. So hop on the pirate bandwagon and play KASSAI of the Golden Sands. As always, everybody, thanks for watching.